Hey everybody, this is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we are here today for a book chat, long overdue book chat with my good friend Jim Thane, and we're going to be talking about his just terrific newish book now, South of the Deuce, which is the fourth in his Phoenix Set police procedural series. And if you've never read his stuff, check it out. It's really, really terrific. And welcome, Jim. It's great to see you.
Good to see you too, Patrick. Thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah,
Fun to be back.
it's great. Yeah, Jim and I are longtime friends, and we're in a long-running, hard-boiled discussion group together.
Right.
Where we
I can hardly wait till we can all be back to do that in person.
Yeah, which I think the first one's going to be next week. So,
right.
Are you going to be able to attend that one?
Oh yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. So yeah, we over the past 20 years or so now, that the group has been running, we dissect this genre, backwards and forwards, and really get into it. And it's a whole lot of fun. I guess as a way of kind of kicking off our little conversation here about this book, I know that the inspiration for the particular story idea has kind of a neat story. Do you want to go ahead and tell that?
Sure. One of the questions that authors always get is, where do you get your ideas? And the story behind this book illustrates the point, I suppose, that they can come from anywhere, and you just have to be alert when the opportunity arises. Several years ago, the Poison Pen had a branch, the Poison Pen Central, which was in an area that was just being rehabilitated just south of Chase Field. Anyhow, there was a big grand opening party for the store. A lot of people were there, and in opening the event, the store owner, Barbara Peters, was introducing people who were in the audience, one of whom was John Talton. John is a Phoenix native who writes a crime series set in Phoenix himself. At the time, he was a reporter for the Arizona Republic, and he's now a columnist for a newspaper in Seattle. At any rate, in introducing John, Barbara noted that he was an authority on Phoenix neighborhoods. And then, somewhat offhandedly, she said, and I think the area where we are today used to be known as the Deuce. From the audience, John corrected her and said, no, the Deuce was north of here. So, two thoughts immediately popped into my mind. I thought, okay, so we're south of the Deuce. And the second thing that popped into my mind was that South of the Deuce would be a great title for a crime novel. I was working on a project at the moment that really didn't seem to be going anywhere. So I decided I'd see if I could come up with a book that would work with that title. So I wrote this book over a period of several months. My agent sold the book, and the first thing the editor said was, we really love this book, but we don't like the title at all. Do you have any other bright ideas? For those people who don't know it, the publisher always has final say over both the cover and the title. I mean, if you're Stephen King or somebody like that, I guess you can argue with them if you want. But when you're a debut author, of course, you just meekly grin and say, sure, I'll think of something else. So I ultimately came up with another title called No Place to Die. And that was the first Sean Richardson book. Thank you, Patrick. That was published under that title. But before the book came out, I went through and I stripped out all the references to the Deuce because I still loved the title and hoped that sooner or later I'd be able to do something with it. So after a couple more of the Sean Richardson novels, I had an idea that would fit again with the title South of the Deuce. So I wrote a new South of the Deuce. This time the publisher liked both the book and the title. And so in the end, I really lucked out. I think that this book actually fits the title much better than my original idea. And so, out of Barbara's casual remark, I got two books. So I'm eternally grateful for that.
Now, for those of the people who might watch this, who aren't from Phoenix or maybe do live here, but aren't aware of the Deuce and what it was, care to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. for much of Phoenix's history, the city's vice was concentrated in an area downtown, roughly from Van Buren in the north to the railroad tracks in the south, along 2nd Street. And interspersed among the more legitimate businesses in that area were the brothels, the gambling dens, the single residency hotels, flop houses, saloons, stuff like that. Then beginning in the middle 70s, I guess, maybe a little earlier than that, much of that area was raised in the name of urban renewal. And the old Deuce basically disappeared and was replaced by the new Civic Center and a Hilton Hotel and a variety of other more legitimate businesses. And the people and the institutions that were confined to the Deuce for much of the city's history got spread out to other areas of the city. But again, for a long time, that's where most of the city's more sordid activity was located.
And it's funny, you know, for those of us who are interested in this kind of history, you know, the criminal history of Phoenix and kind of the underbelly, you know, once you start looking into it, you
Yes,
realize, you know, what a rich criminal and very interesting history that, you know, if you drive around downtown, you would have no idea that it existed.
right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, if you drive through the area today that once was the Deuce, you'd never know that it had this kind of sordid background.
Right. And then there's and as I understand it, you know, there were some famous alleys that had alleyway entrances to some of these, you know, bars and, you know, gambling dens.
Right, that's what I understand.
Paris Alley being probably the most known.
Right.
But so what's really interesting about this book is how you sort of tied a contemporary case, a contemporary serial killer case, back to this old case from, I think it was 43 years, 76.
Yeah, so the late 70s. I wanted at least part of the Deuce to still be in existence. And so in the late 70s, there's an area of the Deuce that still remained pretty much as it had been for quite a while. So that was about as I pretty much had to set the book at that point so that I still had a viable Deuce to work with.
Right. Can you just briefly outline, you know, sort of the plot of the book, and then we can dig deeper into it?
Sure. So again, the protagonist here is a Phoenix homicide detective named Shawn Richardson. And Shawn and his partner are called out early one morning to Central Park, which is downtown Phoenix, just south of the Talking Stick Resort Arena. The body of a young woman has been found in the park, wrapped in plastic, murdered. And when the team arrives and the coroner arrives and pronounces the victim, she's wrapped up with a vintage Louis Vuitton purse. Richardson opens the purse and finds in it the driver's license of a woman who was murdered and left on the exact same spot exactly 43 years earlier. The first victim was a housewife who had been killed, dumped in the same spot, and who was the first of 4 victims back in the late 70s who were kidnapped, murdered, and abandoned south of the Deuce. But the killer was never identified, never captured. So naturally, Richardson is shocked to find this driver's license, tying this murder back to the original killings. He's further stunned to learn that the current victim, the woman he's just found, is the granddaughter of the woman who'd been murdered and left on the same spot all those years ago. So clearly the cases are tied together. Either the original killer has returned to take up where he left off, or some ardent disciple has appeared on the scene to take over the franchise. But in any case, Richardson now finds himself in a desperate race to stop a killer who it turns out is looking to replicate all 4 of the original killings.
And what's so cool, I mean, it's a great idea. And what's so cool about it is that, Richardson essentially has to go back and completely open up the original story.
Right.
And he, early on, he finds I guess, who is the lead detective on the case,
Right.
a guy named Jack Oliva, I think is.
Oliver.
Oliva, yeah.
Right.
And so, who's, getting older, but he's still alive and well, and living in the Willow District downtown.
Right.
And so what ensues is a really cool thing, where these 2 cops of different generations get together, and we'll dig deeper into how how they work together. But what I thought was so neat about it was that there's an underlying respect for this old generation of cops, Phoenix cops, who both of us know some of them. They're still around. One in particular, I'm not sure if you know him, but a guy named Calvin Lash.
I know of him. I haven't ever actually met him.
I got to get you guys together, because he was the cop who responded to the Miranda murder. When he was when he was
and I
killed.
recognize the name, of course, from Tim Moore's book.
Tim Moore, absolutely. Another guy.
Who's also a retired homicide detective.
Yeah.
That whole business with Jack Oliver, again, that's one of those things that caught me by surprise, because as soon as I established the fact that this new case was related to the one from 43 years ago, I needed to have a way to have Richardson get back into the earlier cases. So I had him look up the records in the police department, and he discovers that the original lead detective is still alive, still living in Phoenix. So I thought, okay, I'll just have the 2 of them sit down together so that the older detective can bring Richardson up to speed on the original investigation, and maybe, hopefully, provide some clues that might help resolve this new set of cases. And my intention was that they'd just sit down, have this conversation, and that'd be the end of it. Richardson would then take the information and go off and keep working the case. But I felt some kind of chemistry between the 2 characters when I wrote that initial scene. And so I decided to bring him back for another scene, and then for another scene. And pretty soon he'd become
going all over the valley together.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
And that's so much fun, because you can tell that it reinvigorates Oliva.
Yeah. Definitely.
And they, as I say, it gives this kind of dignity to the older generation. And also, they both learn something from each other. They really interact together well.
Yeah.
I thought that those were some real magic scenes in the book.
Thank you. I really had fun writing those. That was the big surprise of this book for me. I mean, again, Richardson's partner on the police force is a woman named Maggie McClinton. And I just assumed, of course, that this was going to be another Shawn and Maggie book. And by the time it, got finished, Jack Oliver had kind of elbowed Maggie off the page a little bit. But
she's in the book. She's in the book, but she's off stage a lot more than usual.
Yeah, more than she certainly is in the first 3 books.
Right. Now, was there a particular case did you completely invent this, the main case in 1976?
Yes. Yeah. There was, I just made it up out of thin air.
Yeah. So there was no particular series of murders that you based on. Gotcha. Yeah, and one of the things, about your books, they are real true procedurals. I think, they're character-driven procedurals, but they're so tightly done. And I know that, you were a historian in a previous life, and taught history. And can you talk a little bit about how? I mean, it seems like your training as a historian informs your fiction to a big degree. Are those two disciplines simpatico, you think?
I don't know that well, yeah, I think they are, but I think it's the general skills that I picked up as an historian, learning how to do research. The first things that I wrote, that were published were all nonfiction. So that was some preparation for ultimately, trying to write novels. But yeah, I think it's the research skills as much as anything else that carried over from one to the other. And that's particularly true of my next book.
Oh, okay. So what kind of research did you have to do for this book? I mean, to really get into the Deuce and describe Old Phoenix with authority.
Well, I read as much as I could. I've got a number of histories of the city of Phoenix. I have talked to a number of police officers, both current and former. I mentioned Tim Moore a minute ago. He's been a huge help to me in terms of how the Phoenix PD actually works, how a case back then would have been investigated as opposed to now, where the records are stored, all that sort of thing. So, between reading what I could and talking to people like Tim, that's basically how I did the research.
With the procedural detail, getting that stuff right, what would happen in a crime scene,
Right.
who was there, getting those very specific details right. Was that something that Moore helps you with, or other
He
cops?
does, although when I first started to try to write police procedurals, I went out and bought a number of the basic textbooks that they use at police academies and places like that, and lined up on the shelf across the room are a number of those books that talk very specifically about how, detectives are trained to approach a crime scene and, how they conduct interviews and that sort of thing. So that's also part of the more general research, not specifically for this book, but for all of the police procedurals that I've written.
Right. Let me see here. Yeah, there is a kind of a repeating riff in the books. I mean, but some of the details I really love. You're very specific about restaurants, nightclubs, musicians, and and those details are so important. To accurately talking about a city, even though they all change so fast.
Right.
When you talk.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I love about reading crime fiction is reading books that are set in places that, I've never been, and reading about other cities and other states and things like that. So, I'm hoping that people who read my books and who don't live in the Phoenix area get some of that flavor out of my books.
Right. Now, how long have you lived here in town or in Phoenix?
I first bought a condo here in 2002, and for a while I was splitting my time between here and Illinois. Then I moved here permanently in 2011 and have lived here permanently ever since, except for 10 weeks in the summer when I escape the brutal heat and go to Montana.
And this is a book where it's really important not to give away spoilers. I mean, outlined the basic story,
right?
But there's a lot. There's more we can talk about. Certainly,
Sure.
You're for those of us who know you and have known you for a while, we're all fans of your cat. Your cat Zane Grey, and we remember when you found him up in Montana.
Yes.
And brought him back. Well, he's probably getting a big ego because he makes a cameo in this book.
Right.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it was just one of those things that occurred to me on the spur of the moment. Sean and his partner Maggie McClinton go to check out the apartment of a murder victim in the story. And as they go into the apartment, there's this little gray cat who sticks his head out from under the bed, who's obviously been alone for a few days because the person who owns the cat has sadly been murdered. And my cat does that whenever he's really very shy around people for whatever reason. And even if the garbage truck just rolls by, he runs and hides under the bed. And then he'll stick his head out to check and see if it's safe to come out. And for some reason, as I had the detectives walking into this murder victim's bedroom, the thought popped into my mind that the cat would be there. So I had Shane rescue the cat with the intention of taking it to the no-kill shelter. But we'll see what happens with that.
Let's see here. Yeah, and one of the other things about Sean Richardson, maybe we could talk a little bit about him as a character.
Okay.
His great-great-grandfather was one of the original town residents.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about Sean, where he comes from, and sort of what he has his own emotional, stuff that he's been through.
Right. I haven't really fleshed out the character's background very much. When I wrote the first book, No Place to Die, I thought that he needed to have some vulnerability, something that could potentially interfere with his ability to get the job done properly, some weakness. I mean, he couldn't just be 100% perfect. But it's really hard to find something that hasn't been done to death. I mean, the alcoholic cop, the drug addicted cop, the sex addicted, and there are people who have done that really, really well. But again, as we both know, it's been done to death. So I was looking for something that would be a bit different, but would still, again, give him some level of vulnerability. So as the first book opens, his wife of 6 years, whose name is Julie, is in a persistent vegetative state. She's in a coma. She's in a long-term care facility. She was in an auto accident, and her brain was deprived of oxygen for several minutes. And the doctors say that she will never recover. She had written a living will and given Shawn power of attorney for healthcare, and made it very clear that if something like this should ever happen to her, she wanted basically to have the life support ended so that she could die peacefully and with some dignity. So with a very heavy heart, as the first book opens, Richard is trying to honor her wishes. But Richardson has a mother-in-law from hell who refuses, doesn't want the life support to be removed, and so sues to keep the life support functioning. So throughout the first book, there's this ongoing struggle internally with Shawn and externally with him and the mother-in-law, as he tries to perform the most heartbreaking job he's ever had, which is to honor his wife's wishes and let her go, and then let her find some peace. So that goes through the first book in the series. And then in the next book, Richardson is kind of adjusting emotionally. I mean, it doesn't give anything away to say
product placement.
Yeah, thank you. Doesn't give anything away to say that Julie is ultimately going to die. And so in the second book, Shawn has to deal with all the emotional trauma that follows that. And by the third book, he's kind of getting his life back together again. And now in South of the Deuce, he's finally found some emotional stability. He's involved with someone else. And this is the first case, the first book where I've really made any reference to his other family members. So as you pointed out, we learned that his great-great-grandfather was one of the original settlers in Phoenix. He opened a mercantile store here very early after Phoenix was created, and began to build what became a family fortune. Shawn's father was a real estate developer, and we also learn in South of the Deuce how he died. And so Shawn is also dealing to some extent with the question of whether he ever fulfilled his father's expectations of him and that sort of thing. His father had expected that Shawn would come into the business with him, and was disappointed when Richardson decided that his path in life was going to go in a different direction. So that's about as much as we know about him up to this point.
Did you know any of that stuff going in? Or is that stuff that, from a writer's perspective, did it kind of occur to you, hey, that would be kind of cool if we filled this in?
Yeah, I thought it was about time I finally gave him a bit of a backstory, and I wanted him to be a real Phoenician. So I decided that, his family would have deep roots here. He's fourth generation, as it turns out. So that gives him, again, really deep roots in the community that a lot of people don't have here, because so many people like me
Sure.
are transplants who came from somewhere else. But his family history goes back a long way. As for the business of his father, this is again one of those things. If you're writing, these books are written, at least in part, in the first person narrative from Shawns' point of view. How do you describe the character? It's the old gimmick of having him walk by a mirror or look into a mirror when he's shaving and describe himself for the reader. I've tried in a couple of books having people see him on TV when he's being interviewed by a reporter about some crime or something, and then having a character identify the detective as they're seeing him on TV. In this case, I have him sitting down and looking into a mirror behind a bar, which I thought, okay, that's not quite as cheesy as having him looking into the mirror while he's shaving, but at least it gives me an opportunity. And at that point, it occurred to me, okay, he's looking into the mirror, he's seeing back a reflection of a man who looks increasingly like his father as he was getting to be his age. So then I had to figure out, how does the father figure into this? So I wrote that little scene which describes what happened to the father, and I've got Shawn then reminiscing for a little bit about his father, about the similarities between the two of them. And that was the way of introducing the whole business about, did I fulfill my father's expectations or not?
Right. And then, as you mentioned, his new relationship, Sarah?
Yes.
Sarah, yeah. She's a medical examiner.
Right.
And so, of course, it's not easy being in a relationship with a homicide detective.
Right.
But it's probably no bargain being in a relationship with a medical examiner either.
Well,
So,
and that's why that appealed to me, because, each of them have careers that may at times have to take precedence over plans they might have made together. And I wanted somebody who could understand the situation that Richardson is in, because I understand from talking to people that this is always, not all, I shouldn't say always, but is often a matter of tension in a homicide detective's marriage or relationship. And how many movies can you think of where that's the case? I'm just popped into my mind Al Pacino as a detective in Heat, the movie with Robert De Niro, and he's in a relationship with this woman who's just totally frustrated with the demands that the job makes on him. And so I wanted to give Richardson somebody who would understand his situation. He in turn has to understand hers. So if one or the other of them has to get out of bed in the middle of the night to go to a homicide or, whatever, the other person at least knows what the situation is.
Right. And there's again, seeing the story through Shawn's eyes is he has a very sane perspective, which is nice. You feel like you're in good hands with him telling the story and relaying what's going on. And I like how you take us. This one has its base in the old downtown area of Phoenix, but it goes all over the valley.
Yes.
And I like how you, even though he is a Phoenix cop, right?
Right.
The job takes him all over the place.
Right.
And you make some really interesting observations through his eyes about how the different communities interact with each other.
Right.
How, in particular, in this new book, there's just a nice little comment about how, some Phoenicians look down their nose at Scottsdale.
Right.
And call it Snottsdale,
Right.
Some of it for good reason.
Yes.
But not all of it, and you make a nice point that I forget how you phrase it in the book, but that actually I've got it right here. just about how, yeah, here it is. Yeah, people living in the valley's other cities occasionally refer to the town as Scottsdale, capturing the contempt that some feel for the town's residents and their perceived values. It's interesting. But I found that large numbers of people living in Scottsdale don't fit the stereotype. And I've also encountered enough vain, self-centered, and generally unpleasant people in other parts of the valley to believe that they shouldn't be so quick to pass judgment on others. Love that.
Thank you.
Yeah, love that. But yeah, I mean, trying to capture the enormity of this Phoenix metro area, it's quite a task.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and I'm sure most people who haven't visited here, or maybe even a lot of people who have visited here, don't understand the breadth and the complexity of this metro area. I mean, they think Phoenix, okay, but again, there are a ton of other cities and towns that make up this metro area, all of them with their own unique identity, at least to some extent. It really is a very diverse area in which to live.
Are there jurisdictional issues that you kind of bump up against sometimes when, for instance, I think it would be really cool to have a story set in Guadalupe, which is a very interesting, very strange part that you never hear about.
Right.
Do you know much about Guadalupe?
No, I don't.
This little teeny community of, mainly Yaqui, and it's right in the middle of Tempe.
Okay.
And you go in and suddenly you're in a different world completely.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you wonder, are there jurisdictional issues if you're writing a story with a Phoenix cop, just how much realistically can he or she operate in Mesa, for instance, or in Sun City without involving their local law enforcement? Does that ever become a problem?
I asked about that. I was talking when I was writing the first book, because as you say, things take place all over the valley, and sometimes you may have to go question a suspect. If you're a Phoenix cop who's living in Mesa or Tempe or whatever, you may have to go interview people. So a person who was advising me on the first book and who was on the Phoenix PD at the time said, no, it's not an issue if you're just going to talk to somebody. You can go interview people. Obviously, you can't. There are issues where you can't cross the line. So I've always been careful basically to confine the crimes to Phoenix itself so that there isn't a jurisdictional issue. In a couple of the books, I have had murders that occurred outside of Phoenix, where I think I had a body in Scottsdale once. But that crime tied into one that Sean and Maggie were investigating. So in that case, I had them relating with the Scottsdale PD. The Scottsdale PD is investigating its particular case, and Richardson and McClinton are working with them as the two cases relate. But for the most part, I've kept them pretty tightly in Phoenix just to avoid those kinds of issues.
Sure. Now, as a voracious reader yourself, I know, and you've written, you're constantly reading. Right. Are there any authors that sort of maybe directly or even indirectly kind of inspired you when you were writing these procedurals? And of course, you think of Michael Connelly.
Right.
Anybody? Was he an?
Connelly certainly. I would argue that if you're a reader and a writer, practically any book that you read affects you in one way or another and may encourage you to write, or may, you learn both from the things that people do right and from the things that other people may do that, at least in your opinion, are wrong. I've always been a huge fan of Lawrence Block's Matthew Scudder series, which isn't a police procedural series, right, but his books, I think, have taught me a lot. I love John Sanford's Lucas Prey books. And again, as you said, yeah. And you try, it's a thin line. You don't want to be even subconsciously borrowing from other people, but you do want to, learn what you can from them. So, I've been inspired by a ton of people.
Yeah, and we were talking a few minutes ago about, about those important details when establishing your setting, and really giving people a taste of what Phoenix is like. It is important to get those details right.
Yeah, I think
And,
it is. And
and
if you get them wrong, you'll hear from people.
right, so it would seem to me you want something that's going to satisfy the locals,
Right.
but also
Yes.
give somebody who has no idea what this town is about.
Right. Right.
And it makes sense what you talk about with the Scudder books, because he's
Yeah.
writing about New York, but he's very he sets the scene so beautifully.
Yes.
And those taverns and those dark,
Exactly. It's like you could walk those streets yourself and be
Yep.
right there. That's one of the things I really love about those books.
So maybe subconsciously you pick up, okay, I'm not imitating another writer, but that's what
Right.
so-and-so
Yeah.
does really well that I want to do too.
Exactly.
And Pelicanos is also,
Oh, I love his books.
Yeah,
Yeah.
music and those kind of very
Yes.
specific details are so important to his work.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I really wish he'd get back to writing more books.
No, me too.
He's kind of gotten off into film and TV and stuff like that. And I'm really missing the books.
I mean, he's doing some amazing TV, but
yeah, he has. I loved his work on The Wire and some of the
and
other stuff he's done.
The Deuce.
Yeah, that was good.
Right. Well, before we talk about some of the things that are coming up, can you well, I guess this would be coming up too. Do you have ideas of where you'd want to take Richardson next? Are you going to continue?
I hope to at some point, although for the moment he's kind of on hiatus. My next project is maybe a more traditional mystery. It's called Tyndall, and it's set in a little tiny town in the southeast corner of South Dakota. My great-grandfather homesteaded a farm in north of Tyndall in 1877, even before the town was incorporated. And my grandmother and my mother were both born there. My mother was raised in Tyndall. And in 1925, there was a family tragedy that I knew nothing about until long after my mother had died. My mother and grandmother never spoke about this. And I only uncovered it when I began doing some work in my family's genealogy. I decided one time while I was on the way from Illinois to Montana to spend time with my family there, to detour through Tyndall, which is just off the interstate, and spend some time in the library there reading newspapers from 1925 to see if I could get some perspective on what had happened there.
What part of the state is it again, Jim? Just so I can visualize.
It's in the southeast corner. It's the county, it's Bonham County, and it basically borders Nebraska, and it's very close to Iowa. So, I mean, it's really tucked way down there.
Okay.
Anyhow, so I'm doing its genealogical research. I open up the newspapers and discover, oh my God, what this great family tragedy was. So I've been thinking about it for a long time. This is like 15 years ago. And it occurred to me that I might want to write about this business, but I couldn't figure out a way into it. I really didn't want to try to write an actual history. I didn't want to write an historical novel because I didn't think I'd be any good at it. But then when I finished South of the Deuce, I really come to like the Jack Oliva character. And it suddenly occurred to me that at 78 years old, Jack Oliva could be the perfect candidate to investigate this tragedy. So I sent him off looking for his family's roots, which coincidentally just turned out to be in Tyndall. So he goes to Tyndall, again, just trying to do basic genealogical research. He gets a surprise he never anticipates. He discovers that some old scores are never fully settled, and that resurrecting scandals, even those a century old, can sometimes be a very dangerous thing to do. So
Wow.
anyhow, that's where I'm going with the next book, and Richardson is kind of on the back burner for the moment.
Oh, how cool is that? So Jack Oliva, wow, that's great.
Right, he gets to be the protagonist.
You know, it's funny. Have you thought about maybe giving us a young Jack Oliva book in Phoenix?
Oh,
Maybe
that's a great idea.
maybe he knows Richardson's dad or something. I don't know. Who knows?
Just a minute while I write all this down. Don't let all these good ideas go to waste. No, that hadn't occurred to me, but now that you
Kind of a
mention
cool
it,
idea.
it sounds like a very cool idea.
Well, I've been keeping something from you, Shawn.
Yeah, really.
I knew, you know, something
There
like
you
that.
go. Now you're talking.
That's really great. We've neglected to mention, that's real. I can't wait to read about what this tragedy you unfolded
Okay.
is. That's really neat. But as we said, you have deep roots also in Montana.
Yes.
And year before last, you
right.
brought out this book, Crossroads. Before we kind of sign off here, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was born and raised in Western Montana, and for when I was growing up as a child, my family had a cabin on Flathead Lake, which is the largest natural freshwater lake west of the Mississippi. It's about 45 minutes south of Glacier National Park. And back in 1924, my grandfather, who lived in Missoula at the time, borrowed a car. He didn't even own a car, and drove up to Kalispell, Montana, which is about 120 miles north, and bought at government auction 3 lots on the shores of Flathead Lake, which the government was just opening for purchase. He bought 3 lots for $100 a piece, and the government generously allowed him to pay $25 a year, and then gave him full title to each of the things after 4 years when he paid off the $100 a piece. He then built a cabin on one of the lots. And so my father grew up on the lake. My father then wound up with one of the other lots, built a cabin on it. So as a kid, I grew up there. So I have really deep roots on this lake. Unfortunately, that place is no longer in my family, but I've been going back to the lake every summer all my life. And that's where I go now when I get away from Phoenix in the summertime. Anyhow, I wanted to write a book about that area. And when the idea first occurred to me, and again, this was some time ago, there was a real bitter battle that was going on there between environmentalists who were trying to limit logging in the area in the national forest there, and logging interests, sawmills, people like that who wanted to continue developing the forest, that is, exploiting them for the logs.
Sure.
And it occurred to me that there was a story there that I could try to tell about the battle between these competing forces. And in looking for a protagonist, I came up with a Kalispell attorney whose name is Dave Matthews. And as the book opens, Dave is in a very depressed state. He blames himself for the death of one of his closest friends that occurred 10 months earlier.
And his band isn't cool anymore either. So
oh, yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah. His band has left him. So anyhow, he's drinking heavily. He's ignoring his responsibilities when the brother of another really close friend is arrested and charged with the murder of a prominent environmental attorney. The guy who's charged with the murder is a sawmill worker. And he and the attorney had a fight outside a tavern the night before the killing. So obviously he becomes the principal suspect. There's some evidence pointing in his direction. And so Matthews agrees to take his case because the guy is penniless. If Matthews doesn't take the case, he'll have to rely on a public defender, which may or may not do him much good. So Matthews has to, as the story progresses, has to try to defend his client He has to navigate his way through this bitter battle over the environment and at the same time try to find some measure of redemption for himself.
Wow, that's awesome. Sounds great.
Thanks.
Let's see here. So we've covered most of those bases. And then when does Tyndall come out?
November 2nd.
November 2nd. So by that point, we'll be able to do an in-store event.
Oh, that'd be great.
And,
I'd love to do that again.
And also a Facebook event, something like that.
Sure.
Which would be great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we've covered most of the bases. It sure has been fun getting a chance to chat with you about these.
I've enjoyed it very much. I can
Yeah.
hardly wait till, we can do the book club in person, and there'll be live events at the store to go back to. I mean, one of the things I truly love about Phoenix is the Poison Pen bookstore. I stumbled onto it very early on when I first came here, when I first bought my condo. And I've seen so many of my favorite authors there through the years. It's just, been such
quite a ride, hasn't it?
Oh, it's been
so many great people come through.
Yep.
It's been a lot of fun, including one James L. Thane, you've done numerous events here, and really look forward to getting back on track. This pandemic kind of knocked us for a loop.
Yeah, it sure did.
But the main book we've been talking about, folks, is South of the Deuce. And we have signed copies available of all of Jim's books. And I've showed, let's see, this is the first one, No Place to Die. Second one, Until Death. I don't have a copy of Fatal Blow with me, but you might. There's a third book, which we also have. I just forgot to grab it. Sorry.
That's fine.
And then, as I just mentioned, Crossroads. But Jim's a terrific writer. And if you're interested at all in Phoenix history, you owe it to yourself to check out his work. It's really terrific.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yeah. And anyway, look forward to seeing you in the store soon.
Yes, right.
Thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate it.
Been a lot of fun.
It has. Great conversation. Thank you.
Yeah. All right.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.